7 years. For 7 long years, Elizabeth had scrubbed the stains of Willie Romano's cruelty from her soul. Every gaslighting whisper, every belittling glance, every moment he made her feel like a ghost in her own skin. But one night at the Rosewood Charity Gala, he tried to erase it all. He stood before the city's elite, his voice dripping with false pity, painting her as a washed-up trophy wife who traded dignity for diamonds. He thought he had her cornered, shamed, and small again. He thought no one would ever challenge him. He never imagined that her new husband, a man who doesn't just own power but is power, would walk through those ballroom doors. The invitation had been sitting on the glass console table in their penthouse for 3 weeks. A crisp, cream-colored rectangle of judgment embossed with gold lettering. The Rosewood Foundation Annual Gala. Elizabeth Paz. No, she was Elizabeth Paz now, not Elizabeth Romano. Traced the elegant script with a perfectly manicured finger, a familiar knot tightening in her stomach. It wasn't the gala itself that terrified her. It was him. Willie. The name alone was a phantom limb. An ache where a part of her used to be. Amputated 7 years ago, but never truly forgotten. Her husband, Thomas S. Paz, entered the living room, his quiet presence a stark contrast to the storm brewing in her mind. He was a man carved from a different kind of stone than Willie. Where Willie was loud, brash ambition, all performance and peacocking, Thomas was the silent, unshakable authority of a mountain. The kind of man whose shadow alone could shift the temperature of a room. He wore his power like a second skin. Tailored, invisible, absolute. He placed a hand on her lower back, his touch gentle despite the controlled violence she knew lived in those hands. His gaze, dark and perceptive, studied her like he was reading a language only he understood. "You're thinking about it again," he said, his voice a low, calming rumble. It wasn't a question. Elizabeth let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "It's ridiculous. Why do I still let him have this power over me? It's been 7 years since the divorce. Because wounds heal, mia cara, but scars remain." Thomas's thumb drew a slow, grounding circle against her spine. "He was your first marriage. That kind of history doesn't just evaporate." He understood more than anyone the intricate web of her past. He knew the story Willie told the world. The ambitious real estate mogul and his simple, supportive wife who just couldn't keep up with his success. But Thomas knew the truth. The constant belittling. The gaslighting. The way Willie had systematically dismantled her confidence until she felt like a ghost in her own life. Decorative, voiceless, erased. "I don't want to go," she whispered, turning to face him. His eyes, dark as espresso and twice as rich, held no judgment, only a deep, unwavering protection that still, after 4 years of marriage, sometimes felt too fierce to be real. "Then we won't," he said simply. That was the thing about Thomas. He never pushed. He offered sanctuary, a fortress, a quiet place for her to land. It was that very quality, his refusal to control her, that made her want to be braver. "No. I have to." She straightened her shoulders. "If I don't, he wins. He'll tell everyone I was too scared to show my face. That I'm hiding." She looked around their penthouse, a sprawling domain of floor-to-ceiling windows and marble, overlooking the glittering skyline like a kingdom laid at their feet. "He'll say I'm hiding in my gilded cage." The phrase was a direct quote from Willie's last message, a venomous text sent after he'd learned of her engagement to Thomas. A man whose name alone made powerful men nervous, whose wealth and influence existed in shadows Willie could never access. Willie had built a successful real estate empire, but Thomas S. Paz owned the kind of generational power that made men like Willie feel insignificant. And Willie hated feeling insignificant. "What he says is a reflection of him, not you," Thomas murmured, pulling her into his arms with the kind of possessive gentleness that always steadied her. She breathed in his scent. Sandalwood and gunpowder, bergamot and something darker, dangerous. A world away from Willie's cloying designer cologne that always smelled of desperation and overcompensation. "Intellectually, I know that," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "But emotionally, I'm still that 26-year-old woman who believed everything he said about me. That I was lucky to have him. That I wasn't smart enough or sophisticated enough, or enough on my own. Thomas tilted her chin up, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that could stop hearts. Then let me remind you who you are now, he said, his voice dropping to that lethal quiet that preceded action. You are Elizabeth Paz. And tomorrow night, when you walk into that ballroom in your silver armor, you will not be alone. And Willie Romano will learn what it means to disrespect what belongs to me. The promise in his words wasn't comfort. It was a vow. And Elizabeth knew, with absolute certainty, that her ex-husband had no idea what kind of reckoning was coming for him. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 2,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse, turning the glass and steel into a cathedral of pale gold. Elizabeth stood at the edge of their bedroom, wrapped in Thomas's shirt, watching the city below begin its slow crawl toward consciousness. From 40 stories up, the world looked small, manageable, like something she could hold in the palm of her hand. But the knot in her stomach told a different story. She felt him before she heard him, the shift in the air that always preceded Thomas's presence, like the atmosphere itself made room for him. His arms circled her waist from behind, pulling her back against the solid warmth of his chest. He didn't speak. He never rushed her into words she wasn't ready to say. I keep replaying it, she finally whispered. Every scenario, every cutting thing he might say, every way he'll try to make me feel small again in front of everyone. Thomas's lips brushed her temple, a gesture so tender it nearly broke her. He can't make you anything you're not, Tesoro. You know this. Do I? She turned in his arms, looking up at the face that had become her anchor, all sharp lines and quiet danger, softened only for her. Sometimes I look in the mirror and I still see her. Willie's wife. The woman who apologized for taking up space in her own home. His jaw tightened, the only visible sign of the rage he kept leashed for her sake. Thomas had never met Willie Romano, but he'd memorized every wound the man had left on her soul like a soldier studying enemy territory. That woman survived him. She left him. She rebuilt herself into someone he couldn't destroy. His thumb traced her cheekbone. She became the woman standing in front of me. That takes more strength than he'll ever possess. Elizabeth felt the familiar sting behind her eyes but refused to let the tears fall. What if I freeze? What if he says something and I just crumble? You won't be alone. Thomas's voice dropped to that lethal register that made boardrooms go silent. I will be there. And if he forgets himself, if he so much as looks at you the wrong way. He left the threat unfinished, but she felt it in the way his hands tightened possessively at her waist, in the cold calculation that flickered through his dark eyes. She knew what Thomas was. She'd always known. The carefully constructed empire. The associates who moved through shadows. The power that couldn't be explained by legitimate business alone. He'd never hidden it from her, and strangely, it had never frightened her. Because that same darkness that made dangerous men kneel was the fortress he'd built around her heart. Promise me something, she said softly. Anything. Promise me you'll let me face him first. I need to prove to myself that I can stand in the same room and not break. Thomas studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You'll face him. But understand this. His hand cupped her face with devastating gentleness. The moment he crosses the line, he's mine. The dress hung in her closet like a declaration of war. Silver, sleek, custom-tailored to fit her body like a second skin. Elizabeth ran her fingers over the cool fabric, feeling the weight of what tonight meant. This wasn't just a gown. It was armor for a battlefield where the weapons were whispers and the casualties were reputations. Thomas appeared in the doorway of their dressing room, already dressed in his tuxedo, all black, perfectly cut, making him look like death in Italian wool. He leaned against the frame, watching her with that quiet intensity that still made her pulse quicken after 4 years. Second thoughts, he asked. Third, fourth, maybe fifth. She attempted a smile that didn't quite land. I used to dress for Willie. Every outfit was a test I didn't know I was taking. Too flashy meant I was trying too hard. Too plain meant I was letting myself go. I could never just be. Thomas crossed to her in 3 strides, his hands finding her bare shoulders. Tonight you dress for yourself. And perhaps, his lips curved into something dangerous. For me. Because watching you walk into that room in this dress, knowing every man there will look and knowing you're mine, that brings me considerable satisfaction. Heat flushed through her, momentarily displacing the anxiety. Thomas had a way of making her feel simultaneously protected and desired, like a treasure he'd kill to keep safe but also worship on his knees. She stepped into the dress, and he zipped it with the careful precision he applied to everything. The fabric molded to her curves, the silver catching the light like liquid mercury. She'd chosen it specifically because Willie had always insisted she wear muted colors, beiges, soft blues, nothing that would draw attention away from him. This dress demanded attention. This dress refused to apologize for existing. Thomas fastened a diamond necklace around her throat, an heirloom from his family, worth more than Willie's entire quarterly earnings. The stones felt cool and heavy against her skin, a tangible reminder of how far she'd come from the woman who'd left her marriage with nothing but a suitcase and shattered self-worth. There, Thomas murmured, meeting her eyes in the mirror. Now you look like exactly what you are. What's that? Untouchable. His hands rested on her waist, his reflection dark and commanding behind her luminous one. Every person in that ballroom will see what I see. A woman who survived something that should have destroyed her and came out stronger. Let them whisper. Let them judge. You're not there for their approval. Elizabeth studied herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger to the one Willie had diminished, polished, elegant, standing tall in silver armor with a dangerous man at her back. For the first time since the invitation arrived, she felt something other than dread. She felt ready. Let's go remind them who I am, she said. Thomas's smile was predatory. Let's go show them who you've always been. The grand ballroom of the Rosewood Hotel dripped with old money and older grudges. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors, turning the space into a glittering arena where Chicago's elite performed their carefully choreographed rituals of superiority. Elizabeth stepped through the entrance on Thomas's arm, and felt the ripple of recognition move through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. She'd asked Thomas to arrive separately, to give her 30 minutes alone before he made his entrance. She needed to prove she could breathe the same air as these people without her husband's shadow as a shield. He'd agreed reluctantly, but not before positioning 2 of his men in the room, invisible to everyone but her, a silent promise that she was never truly alone. The whispers started immediately. She felt them crawling across her skin like insects. Is that Elizabeth Romano? I heard she married some businessman. Older. Very private. More like very rich. You know what they say about second wives. Elizabeth lifted her chin and moved deeper into the ballroom, her silver dress catching light with every step. She'd been to 1,000 events like this during her marriage to Willie, always as an accessory, always 3 steps behind him, always smiling that vacant smile he demanded. But tonight she walked differently. Tonight she took up space. She made it approximately 7 minutes before she felt his eyes on her. Willie Di Romano stood near the bar, a glass of scotch in his hand, and that smile, that practiced predatory smile, already forming on his lips. He'd aged in the 7 years since their divorce, but not gracefully. His hairline had retreated, and his face carried the bloat of too many client dinners and too much self-importance. But his eyes remained the same. Pale blue, chilly, calculating. The eyes of a man who measured people's worth and always found them lacking. He weaved through the crowd toward her with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. His expensive suit doing little to hide the mediocrity beneath. She watched him approach the way prey watches a predator, with every muscle tensed for flight, every instinct screaming danger. Elizabeth. Her name in his mouth sounded like ownership. I almost didn't recognize you. You look so. His gaze raked over her silver dress with theatrical appreciation that made her skin crawl. Expensive. Marriage must be treating you well. The words were pleasant. The subtext was poison. She heard what he wasn't saying. You're a purchased object. A trophy. Nothing you're wearing belongs to you. It belongs to whoever's paying for you now. Willie. She kept her voice neutral, giving him nothing. His smile widened, sensing blood in the water. The hunter had found his prey, and the evening's entertainment was about to begin. He raised his glass in a mock toast, and Elizabeth realized with sinking certainty that this confrontation wouldn't wait for a private moment. Willie had always preferred an audience for his cruelty. Willie circled her like a shark testing the water temperature, his pale eyes gleaming with the particular malice she remembered from their worst fights, the ones where he'd systematically dismantled her confidence word by careful word. He'd always been good at this, the public performance of casual cruelty disguised as concern. So tell me, he said, loud enough for the nearby clusters of guests to hear. How does it feel to finally live the life you always wanted? All those years you spent complaining about our modest lifestyle, and look at you now. Dripping in diamonds. He gestured to her necklace with his scotch glass, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Elizabeth felt her throat tighten. The modest lifestyle he referenced had been a prison of his making, controlling every dollar she spent, questioning every purchase, making her account for every coffee while he dropped thousands at his club. Willie, I'm not doing this with you. Doing what? I'm just making conversation. His smile was all teeth, no warmth. I'm happy for you, truly. You found someone to take care of you. That's what you always needed, wasn't it? Someone to pay your way, since you never could figure out how to stand on your own 2 feet. The words hit exactly where he'd aimed them, at the scar tissue of every insecurity he'd carved into her during their marriage. She felt the old shame trying to surface, the voice that whispered maybe he was right. Maybe she was just a beautiful shell with nothing substantial inside. Then Willie moved closer and she smelled his cologne, that same aggressive, expensive scent that used to cling to their bedroom, marking territory. Tell me, does your billionaire husband know what a good investment he made? That dress probably cost more than. It happened so fast. His hand swept out in a gesture of theatrical emphasis, and the scotch glass tilted and suddenly red wine. Where had the wine come from? Was cascading down her silver dress in a crimson waterfall. The liquid soaked into the fabric, spreading like blood across the metallic sheen, ruining the careful armor she'd constructed. Oh God, I'm so sorry. Willie's voice carried across the ballroom, drawing every eye to their tableau. But his expression told a different story, the barely suppressed satisfaction, the gleam of victory in those chilly eyes. How clumsy of me. Elizabeth, these things happen at parties, don't they? Accidents. The word hung in the air, mocking. There was nothing accidental about this. He'd orchestrated it perfectly, turning her moment of strength into a spectacle of humiliation. She stood frozen, wine dripping down her legs onto her silver heels, feeling the weight of 100 stares, hearing the sharp intake of breath that preceded gossip. Willie raised his hands in exaggerated apology, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Someone get this poor woman a napkin. That dress must have cost her husband a fortune. The laughter started as a ripple and built into a wave. Not the uncomfortable laughter of witnesses to an awkward moment, but the deliberate, knowing laughter of people who'd been waiting for permission to judge. Willie had just given them that permission, gift wrapped in false concern. Elizabeth stood in the spreading pool of wine, her silver armor compromised, and watched her old social circle close ranks around Willie like iron filings to a magnet. These were the same people who'd smiled at her during her marriage, who'd complimented her hosting skills and told her how lucky Willie was. Now they looked at her like she was a stain on their pristine event. Bethany Wells materialized first, a razor blade wrapped in Chanel. She'd been Willie's paralegal once, before she married a hedge fund manager and reinvented herself as a society maven. Elizabeth, honey, she cooed, her voice dripping with counterfeit sympathy. What a terrible accident. Though I suppose these designer gowns are so delicate. Not really practical for actual events, are they? More for photo opportunities. The implication landed like a slap. Photo opportunities. Instagram wives. Women who existed as decorations rather than people. Someone should tell her husband he's wasting his money. Another voice chimed in, Marcus Kellerman, one of Willie's golf buddies, a man whose entire personality was his portfolio. Designer gowns on a girl from nowhere. It's like putting a Rembrandt in a trailer park. The circle tightened. They smelled blood, and like all predators, they moved in for the kill. Elizabeth recognized the dynamic from her marriage. Willie had always surrounded himself with acolytes, lesser men who fed off his cruelty and amplified it for his entertainment. She'd forgotten how suffocating it felt to be on the receiving end of their collective contempt. I heard she was a secretary when Willie met her, Bethany Stage whispered to the woman beside her. Sweet story, really. He tried to make her into something more, but you can't teach class, can you? Now she's just found someone else to pay for the fantasy. Gold digger, someone murmured, just loud enough to be heard. The word hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. She'd rebuilt herself from nothing after leaving Willie, worked 3 jobs, put herself through business courses, clawed her way back to personhood. And they reduced it all to this. A woman who traded one wallet for another. Willie stood at the center of his circle, his expression a masterpiece of false regret while his eyes gleamed with triumph. This was what he'd wanted, not just to humiliate her, but to rewrite the narrative of their divorce. To make everyone believe he'd been the victim of an ungrateful wife who'd abandoned him for richer pastures. Elizabeth felt her hands trembling, the wine still dripping from her dress onto the marble floor. The old voice whispered in her head, "Run. Hide. Disappear before they destroy what's left of you." Then the ballroom doors opened, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees. Willie must have sensed his window closing, must have felt the shift in atmospheric pressure that preceded Thomas's arrival. He moved with the desperate speed of a man determined to land his killing blow before the executioner arrived. With theatrical confidence, he strode toward the small stage where the evening speeches would be delivered, grabbing a fresh glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying across the ballroom with practiced ease. "If I could have your attention for just a moment." The crowd turned toward him with the eager attention of Romans at the Colosseum. They knew a spectacle when they saw one building, and Willie Romano had always known how to work a room. Elizabeth felt her stomach drop as conversations died and all eyes fixed on the stage, and by extension on her, still standing in her wine-soaked silver dress. "I know this isn't my event to commandeer," Willie continued with false humility, "but I find myself overcome with nostalgia tonight. You see, I'm standing here looking at someone I once knew very well. Someone I once loved." His gaze found Elizabeth, pinning her in place. "My ex-wife, Elizabeth." The ballroom held its collective breath. This wasn't going to be a reconciliation toast. Everyone could smell the venom beneath the sugar. "Elizabeth and I had something special once. Simple, genuine, real. She was happy then in our little life. Or at least I thought she was." He paused for effect, letting the implication settle. "But I suppose some people are never satisfied with genuine happiness. Some people need more. Need bigger. Need expensive." Laughter rippled through certain sections of the crowd. Elizabeth felt paralyzed, a specimen under glass, unable to move or speak as Willie constructed his narrative around her. "Looking at her tonight in that beautiful dress wearing those stunning diamonds, I can't help but think." He raised his glass as if in genuine tribute. "She got exactly what she wanted. The cage is bigger now. More gilded. But it's still a cage, isn't it, Elizabeth?" The words landed like a blade between her ribs. "Ghost in a beautiful cage." The exact phrase he'd used during their worst fight, when she'd finally worked up the courage to say she was unhappy. He'd told her she was a ghost haunting her own life, that she'd already disappeared and just didn't know it yet. "I hope your new husband appreciates what he bought," Willie said softly, poison wrapped in velvet. I hope he knows that the woman standing there in her ruined dress isn't the real Elizabeth. The real Elizabeth died somewhere between our divorce and her desperate climb back into relevance. What's left is just. The ballroom doors slammed open with a sound like a gunshot. Thomas S. Paz didn't walk into the ballroom. He manifested like a storm front that turned daylight to dusk in seconds. The chandeliers seemed to dim. The oxygen seemed to thin. Every conversation died mid-syllable as 200 guests turned to witness what primitive instinct recognized as apex predation entering the territory. He wore his tuxedo like a second skin, perfectly tailored, absolutely black. But it wasn't the clothes that commanded attention. It was the way he moved, economical, purposeful, like violence in a holding pattern. Two men flanked him at a respectful distance, their expressions flat and professional in a way that suggested military training and a complete absence of moral hesitation. Elizabeth felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. He'd come. She'd asked for 30 minutes alone, and he'd given her exactly that, not a second more. Thomas Paz kept his promises with the precision of a Swiss watch, and right now his promise was written in the cold fury of his expression. Willie's voice faltered mid-sentence, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. From the stage, he had a perfect view of the doors, and whatever he saw in Thomas's approach made his practiced confidence flicker like a candle in the wind. The crowd parted without conscious thought, bodies instinctively creating a corridor between Thomas and his wife. No one spoke. No one moved. They recognized power when it walked among them, and this wasn't the corporate power they were accustomed to negotiating with over conference tables. This was something older, darker, infinitely more dangerous. Thomas's eyes never left Elizabeth. He crossed the ballroom with that predator's grace, and she watched him catalog everything in milliseconds. Her wine-stained dress, her trembling hands, Willie's position on the stage, the circle of vultures who'd been feeding on her dignity. His jaw tightened fractionally. The only visible sign of the rage she knew was incinerating everything behind that controlled exterior. He reached her in 20 strides that felt like an eternity compressed into seconds. Without a word, he shrugged out of his tuxedo jacket and draped it over her shoulders, a gesture of possession and protection that transformed her wine-soaked vulnerability into something else entirely. The jacket still held his body heat, smelled like sandalwood and gunpowder and safety. Then Thomas did something that made Bethany Wells gasp audibly. He lifted Elizabeth's hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles with old-world formality, his eyes never leaving hers. The tenderness of the gesture was devastating against the brutal threat of his presence. "Mia cara," he murmured, his voice carrying in the absolute silence. "I apologize for my tardiness. I see we have a pest problem that requires immediate extermination." Only then did he turn to look at Willie, still frozen on the stage like a rabbit that had just realized the shadow overhead belonged to a hawk. Thomas smiled. It was the most terrifying thing Elizabeth had ever seen. Thomas moved with the casual efficiency of a man who'd orchestrated far worse than public humiliation in his 43 years. He walked toward the stage with measured steps, each footfall deliberate, giving Willie exactly enough time to understand what was coming but not enough to escape it. "Mr. Romano," Thomas said conversationally, his accent making the name sound like a diagnosis. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Thomas Paz, Elizabeth's husband." Willie tried to rally, tried to summon that courtroom bravado that had won him lesser battles. "Mr. Paz, it was only a toast, a bit of nostalgia between old." "You poured wine on my wife's dress." Thomas's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. Each word landed with the weight of a judge's gavel. "You called her a ghost. You implied she purchased property." He reached the stage stairs. "These are not the actions of nostalgia. These are the actions of a small man trying to make himself feel large." The two men who'd entered with Thomas moved to flank the exits. Not obviously threatening but present. A reminder that this ballroom had become something other than a social event. It had become Thomas Paz's courtroom, and he was judge, jury, and executioner. Willie's face flushed red, that familiar anger rising. "Now listen here, you can't just." Thomas moved. One moment he was at the base of the stage. The next his hand was wrapped around Willie's throat, lifting him slightly onto his toes. Not choking, not yet, but the promise of it lived in those iron fingers. The champagne glass shattered on the stage floor. "I want you to understand something," Thomas said quietly, his face inches from Willie's. "Every word you spoke tonight about my wife? Every insult, every insinuation, every moment of humiliation you tried to carve into her? I felt it. And I remember everything." With controlled force, Thomas drove Willie down. The man's knees hit the wine-soaked marble with a crack that echoed through the silent ballroom. Willie gasped, his expensive trousers soaking through instantly, his hands instinctively reaching for Thomas's wrist, finding it immovable as stone. "You will apologize," Thomas said. "Not a request. A statement of inevitable fact." You can't." Willie's voice came out strangled, his pale eyes wide with something he'd probably never felt before. Genuine fear. Thomas's grip tightened fractionally. "You will apologize to my wife. You will mean it. And then you will leave this city, because if I see you near her again..." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "I will show you what happens to men who forget their place." Willie's face had gone from red to white. His hands shook. He looked at Elizabeth, kneeling in the wine he'd spilled on her, and for the first time in 7 years, she saw him as he truly was. Small. Pathetic. Powerless. "I'm sorry," Willie choked out. Thomas didn't release Willie immediately. He let the man kneel there, trembling, soaked in wine and humiliation, while every phone in the ballroom stayed carefully pocketed. No one would photograph this moment. No one would speak of it outside these walls. That was the power Thomas wielded. Not just physical dominance, but the kind of influence that made witnesses forget what they'd seen. Elizabeth stepped forward, Thomas's jacket still wrapped around her shoulders, her ruined silver dress clinging to her legs. She looked down at Willie, really looked at him, and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The fear that had lived there for 7 years, the phantom limb of trauma that he'd amputated, suddenly went quiet. He was just a man. A weak, insecure man who'd needed her smallness to feel big. "Stand up," she said quietly. Thomas released his grip immediately, stepping back to give her space but remaining close enough to be a promise. Willie struggled to his feet, his knees wet, his face a mask of humiliation and impotent rage. The crowd watched in absolute silence, no longer entertained predators but cowed witnesses. Elizabeth turned to face them, Bethany with her frozen smile, Marcus with his dismissive smirk now carefully erased, all of Willie's acolytes who'd laughed at her expense. She saw them clearly now, saw the emptiness behind their expensive clothes and practiced superiority. "I want to clarify something," she said, her voice steady, carrying across the ballroom without effort. "Not for Willie's benefit, but for yours." She gestured to the crowd. "You all think you know my story. The secretary who married the lawyer, then traded up for the billionaire. Gold digger. Trophy wife. A ghost in a gilded cage." She let the words hang there, all the labels they'd whispered and some Willie had spoken aloud. "But here's what actually happened." Elizabeth pulled Thomas's jacket tighter around her shoulders. "I spent 6 years married to a man who systematically destroyed every piece of confidence I had, who made me apologize for breathing too loud, who convinced me I was worthless without him." She looked at Willie, and her voice didn't waver. "And then one day I left. I walked out with nothing but a suitcase and built myself back from ash." Willie's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Thomas's presence behind her made speech inadvisable. "My life didn't begin when I met Thomas," Elizabeth continued, her eyes sweeping the crowd. "It began when I left Willie. When I chose myself. Thomas didn't save me. I'd already saved myself. He just recognized what I'd become and loved me for it." She turned back to Willie, seeing him completely now. Deflated. Ordinary. Unable to hurt her ever again. "You can't make me small anymore," she said softly. "I've outgrown you." Thomas's hand found the small of her back, and together they walked toward the exit, leaving Willie kneeling in his malice, surrounded by witnesses who would never speak his name with respect again. The fortress had been held, and Elizabeth Paz walked free. Thank you for watching this story to the end. Please like and subscribe. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It is crazier and more intriguing as I can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.